How's that? And tonight we have the minister on with us, and he and I certainly agree of the value of having somebody like you on the deck. So with that, I will ask you, Emma, would you have a word to say to us?
I just wanted to say thank you for including me in this meeting, and that I'm really grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you for being part of us. Yeah. You, the superintendent, he recruited you for us, so that's great. I will now ask the deck members to take a look at the agenda, and I'd love to have a motion to approve. Just give me your name, and Denise will take the notes for the minutes.
Mr. Chair, just before we approve the agenda, I wanted to make a point about the agenda. New business 6.1 says it's a presentation on the decision-making process relocation of the new Besborough School. I just want to make absolutely sure that everyone understands that we're replacing two schools in the West End, Hillcrest School and Besborough School, with a new school. And although I understand the semantics and perhaps why it needs to be worded that way, over the last few weeks, I've found it personally troubling with some of the discussion that's taken place in the neighborhood. We are replacing two schools and bringing two communities together into one school, and I don't want anyone to lose sight of that. So I don't expect the wording to be changed, but I want to make sure and make that point, and that's appreciated. Thank you.
No, we'll make that amendment. Absolutely, that's the way it should be. Two schools for sure. Thank you, Norval. That means now, with it amended, you will approve the agenda.
I'll make the motion. Yes.
Good man. Could I have a seconder?
Second.
Right, I think that was
Second. Yeah.
Okay. So you've heard the motion to approve the agenda as adjusted. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Contrary minded, agenda is approved. Declaration of conflict of interest. Give yourselves a little quick thought on that, and I'll give you about 15 more seconds. Not hearing from anybody, I'm going to declare that there's no conflict of interest tonight. 4.0, approval of the minutes of September the 15th. It's been circulated. I'd love to have a mover and a seconder.
I'll move. Ian.
Ian's moving. Approval of the minutes. The seconder.
I'll second it, Michelle.
Michelle, thank you very much. So we've heard the motion to approve the minutes of September the 15th. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Contrary minded, motion carried. Now we're down to the new business 6.0, and I just want to speak for a second to say we're very pleased that the minister is with us tonight, and Tony Weber is with us tonight as we expected. And as soon as I finish that, we will begin. And all the deck members will have a chance at the end. I'd like to see us let Mr. Weber do his full presentation, and you can maybe note your questions, and then we'll have a good question period for the deck members and both the PSSE chairs after that. So with that, Minister, I'll hand it over to you for some of your thoughts, and maybe you could introduce Tony formally for me.
Sounds great. Thanks, Harry, very much for having Tony and I on this evening to answer questions around school building decisions and really anything else as well that folks might like to ask about. I'd say I'm going to have to leave the meeting at 10 to 7, so I've got another meeting at 7 I've got to get to in another part of my constituency. But if anyone has any questions or follow up afterwards, Harry, perhaps if there's anything coming off Facebook or anything where an answer from me would be helpful or appropriate, you can fire those off to me in an email and I'll send them back and they can be shared at the next meeting or online or however folks see fit.
Very, very nice. Well, pleased to do that. Yeah.
So in terms of the conversation, my hope is that we can come out of this evening explaining the process that the department is using to build new schools, decide where those new schools go. And Tony Weber, in charge of our facilities, has a wealth of experience in both managing those processes and also talking to communities about them. Because anytime you build a new school, there's nearly always some level of controversy, especially in a case like this where you're talking about, as was said before, two communities coming together around a new school. But that obviously is always going to bring disappointments for folks who felt that the school should have been or could have been in an area closer to where they live, to their community, or in any number of other reasons. So I don't want to minimize any of those concerns, because this process is always difficult. My hope is that once we get through this, that in a couple of years' time, we will have a great new school that'll bring communities together, and that we can address most, if not all, of the concerns that we're going to hear from folks this evening and over the next little while. But while the decision has been made, and this is a discussion around how the process reached this particular conclusion, I always welcome folks who, from their close analysis in the communities of this process, feel that there could be improvements made. Let me know. We had an Auditor General's report that came out today, throwing some criticisms the way of the department, which I completely accept in some cases, wholeheartedly reject in others. But one of the things that goes along with embracing change in a large and complicated structure like the Department of Education is that you're always going to be moving steadily towards hopefully a better outcome. And in this case, it's a much more transparent process about the locations for new schools, which new schools are going to be built, and then at the end, the name of the school as well. And my goal has been to move away from the process in the past that led to ministers having involvement in those procedures. And I've, as much as possible within the law, removed myself from discussions around a school in my constituency here in Hanwell, the new school already being built in Moncton, and the new school we're talking about here tonight. So my job was to make sure the procedure was followed in terms of where the procedures followed for deciding which new schools would be built. Then where they followed in terms of where those schools should be built. And then finally, again, the name, where I'm trying to give as much as possible, give away the power that I have there to choose the name for a school. It makes no sense to me that a guy sitting in Fredericton would get to choose the name of a school in Dieppe, Miscou, Edmundston, St. Stephen, or anywhere else in the province. So all that being said, I think my goals are fairly clear in terms of the way I'd like to see processes change and how I'd like to see them continue to evolve. Anyone has any questions on that, happy to answer them. But again, the person who's really going to be able to answer your questions this evening is Tony Weber, because he's got expertise in this file. He's worked in it for a long time. His military background gives him a level of precision and attention to detail that I've really appreciated in my conversations with him, because when I ask him detailed questions, he gives me detailed answers. And I'm sure he'll be able to do the same for folks this evening. That my approach as minister and with the whole department, and Tony's always been enthusiastic about this, unless it's restricted under the law, there's no reason the public shouldn't know about it. So we're here to answer your questions. And I'll be here through till 10 to 7 and look forward to being part of the conversation. So with that, pass it over to Tony. And thanks again, Tony, for giving up part of your evening to be part of the conversation tonight. And I'm sorry that both of us can't be with you in person, but hopefully we'll soon be back to Orange and we can go back to seeing each other face to face once more.
Thank you, Minister. Go ahead, Tony.
Screen now, and I'll bring up the presentation. Sorry, thank you, Minister and Harry. I'll just bring up my screen and share the presentation. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. And you'll note we don't refer to it as Besborough replacement. It's New Moncton West End K-8 school. This is the aim of the presentation here is to explain to you how we went through the construction of the selection of the site for the construction of a new K-8 school in Moncton, replacing both the Besborough and the Hillcrest schools. When we go through site selection, there's a number of things we use in our planning guidelines, which is a document that determines, given the grade group of a school, so if it's a K-5 or a middle school or a high school or a K-12 school, there are certain criteria we have in our planning guidelines that define what that school should have in it in order to meet pedagogical needs. It also includes the size of the school has an impact. So depending on the size and the type of school would determine the number of sports fields that they may have. It may determine the size of a cafeteria or cafetorium they have inside the school, and play areas, pea gravels, etc. So with respect to your specific school we're talking about here, we're talking about a school of the size of over 700 students. It's probably going to approach close to 800 students by the time the planning team finishes working on it. Between the two schools now, you have a population of close to 750 students between the two schools now. There's also a requirement for a sports field that we would put in there, playground areas, hard surface play areas, parking space, and I think the figure they're working with now is about 123 parking spots for the people that are there. Typically, we try to have an outdoor classroom with the pedagogical processes that are used right now. There's a requirement for a dedicated bus drop-off area for safety concerns, and in this case, they're looking at 8 to 12 buses to be able to be parked in the drop-off area, and a dedicated parent drop-off area. A lot of parents now drive their kids to school because of sports and other issues, and we try to avoid congestion for safety reasons. With the criteria we use for planning, once we look at the planning guidelines, we first take the direction that the deck gives on the general location for the school, which is in accordance with the Education Act and their responsibilities. We then look at the planning guidelines, what the preferred acreage is for this type of school based on the planning guidelines mentioned above. What is the accessibility that's required, or the accessibility of a site? Is a site centralized with respect to where the students are located? We try to centralize it as much as we can. Is it a site that has ease of a construction, or is it, so for example, are you sitting on a rocky outcrop, or are you sitting with something that has a significant slope to it that impacts the ability to construct? And is it complementary land use? We don't want to put a school in an industrial zone and have the same issue we had similar to École Champlain in the Moncton area, where there was a lot of industry around the school and it was not conducive to a good learning environment. So that's sort of the general outline of the things we look at in the criteria when we start going into the process for site selection. The actual process we get into once the deck does its submission for the new school project with the general site location, we work with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure to investigate potential sites. DTI has a properties division and branch with property officers who specialize in this activity. And the property officer would go out and look at, based on the criteria from the project plan, look for where is there available real estate in the general area where we want to have the school, look at the sites and conduct any applicable tests, whether it be water or soil requirements, determine if that site has available services to it, whether it's gas, electricity, is the site accessible from arteries in order to move traffic, busing, parents, staff into the school. We do liaise with municipalities on this as we go through this. There's sensitivity when the property officer is out there, and you can imagine if you're talking in, and this is a process for the province. So when we're talking about doing site selections, it could be in this instance where we're talking about in a municipality and it's only the municipality and the deck that's involved in this. Another example is where we're doing a rationalization where 3 communities may be losing a school and 1 school is being created to replace that. Then there's huge competition between the municipalities to get that school in their municipality because of the payment in lieu of taxes or the taxes that come with it. So when a community loses a school, they lose a part of their tax base. So it becomes can be quite controversial in that sense. We also have to worry about when we're dealing with available properties, particularly in built-up areas. You have to deal with developers and their land. And when the site property officer has to work with the developer to get options on the land and pay for a price to be held for a certain period of time before a decision is made, that has to be done with confidentiality. The developer doesn't want their prices known to people once they've been negotiated. And if we share that information, it could create an increase in costs as other developers look to take advantage of that. So there's a sensitivity around the getting the options on land and the prices that are negotiated. Once DTI has done their initial assessment of the area we're looking for the school, we get briefed on the potential sites. There could be there's been incidents where we had 6 or 7 sites that couldn't have been applicable to it. And we try to bring those sites down in number to 3 or 4 for a decision brief. And at this point in time, we would normally engage the district, and we did in this case, engage the district through the process to say, okay, here's what we're looking at. What are your thoughts on this? And how does this fit with respect to how the district sees this working? As I mentioned, the challenges, land is at a premium as schools are developed in neighborhoods that already exist. And you tend to have limited siting options in built up areas, particularly if you're looking at rationalizing schools and combining them and trying to keep them in the built up area. What we're looking at the end is a site that is capable of accommodating the new school to meet the population demands now and in the future, because typically there tends to be growth around schools after they've been built, and that it is effective and functional for the pedagogical requirements that we're trying to meet for that age group and that population. So this is a map layout of the catchment area and the students that are attending the 2 schools concerned. And you can see they go out on either side, but what's highlighted in pink is the actual boundary of the new school that we're looking at putting in. That's not to say other people still won't come in from outside, but that's sort of the area we want to focus for the school to go. Drilling in on that, that's the same area there on a map photo looking at it with the sites that we were able to identify for consideration or option. And there's 4. There's a site out by Millennial Drive, option A. There's there's Besborough at option B, and I'll talk about 2 options with Besborough. There was Hillcrest at option C, and there was Bernice McNaughton, the land available at Bernice McNaughton as option D. As you can see when you look at that, there's not a whole lot of other space in there that isn't city park land or built up already around it. This is a drill down on option A, Millennium Drive option. This was actually, when we started looking at this, it looked like it would be a good site for the school, and it was under serious consideration. We're trying to look for, typically for a school of this size, we try to get one for 24 acres, but when you're working in a built up area, we appreciate that that is probably not reasonable. This site had almost 14 acres available to it. I didn't list the purchase price in there, but the purchase price was in the millions, plural. It was not cheap. The pros for this school, when we were looking at it, was if we were to build on this site, the school operations at the 2 existing schools could continue. We wouldn't interfere with education while we were building the school. There is a potential revenue for the sale of both schools on the sites they were in. The zoning for Millennial Drive is congruent with putting in a school, and it does allow for redevelopment of that area. I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but it used to be a rail yard. And so it's a redevelopment of land from a previous use. There is it's a neutral site for bringing 2 school communities together. Historically, when there tends to be issues when you bring 2 schools together and there's a perception or reality that the school is going to be named or have the identity of one or the other of the 2. And that tends to be a challenge. The cons associated with this site, the price for it was expensive. There's costs associated with redeveloping the site. And one of the things that came to light, there was a couple of reports on the land. There was site contamination on there from the rail yard and the work that was in there. And there was some reports on remediation. And this, of course, had all kinds of concerns that if we decide to put a school there, there's the perception of, building a school for young kids on a contaminated site. And the question of site delays if there was expensive remediation in there. And as good as your remediation may be, you're never going to get all of the potential contaminants. It was big next to a busy road, and there would have likely been an increase in busing compared to where the schools are located now. So when we looked at the where the operational came into from a DTI building perspective, based on the remediation costs, the associated risk, and the costs of the site itself, it would not be recommended. From an EECD operational perspective, given the size and the ability to put the components of the school in there, it would have worked. So that's the Millennial site. Option B, Besborough. Now we have two options with Besborough. We looked at one option with Besborough without the daycare property beside it, and another option assuming that we acquired the daycare property and could incorporate it into the land available. So this is the first option without the daycare. If you look at this site, you see how compressed this is. There were pros with this. There was no land acquisition cost, and the school is central. It remains in the residential area, and the area is fully serviced. Those are all good things. The cons, there would be a requirement then to demolish the building prior to construction. You would have had to displace those students during construction, and we're talking about approximately 600 students that would have to be relocated somewhere in the ASD East school system in that area. And having done that before and having had districts experience that before in other areas, such as recently in St. John, that is not an easy task. Right now in ASD East, the city schools are close to capacity, if not at capacity in some areas. Even if we did that and moved the students out, it would be a compressed site, as you can see from the layout. There's no room for expansion there, and we try to build schools now that allow for, if there's growth in the area, to put portables beside it or build an extension if necessary in order to accommodate growth. We're looking at right now for a school we put in Riverview, for example, in ASD East, where we're looking at an extension on a school we recently built. This school, if we were to build it, would not have that capacity on this site. The sports field in this orientation is not correct. It has to do with the rise and fall of the sun, and it might not sound like a great thing until you start using the soccer field and you find yourself staring into the sun one way or another. It also doesn't have the appropriate space around it for safety. You'd have to build a fence, and effectively you'd step off the field and you'd be into a fence. This is not a neutral site for bringing schools together. It would put a preference towards Besborough as opposed to Hillcrest. It would require the school be 3 stories in a low-rise residential area. And we can build multiple story schools, 2 or 3 story schools. But for this age group, there's a safety risk when you start getting into, won't say high rise, but multiple levels of school. If you think about a fire drill, you can't use an elevator. You've got students with mobility issues. Taking a student downstairs in one of those track vehicles is not easy. And if you got multiple stairs to do that on, it puts the person taking the child down and the child, him or herself, at risk at that time. It also means that there may be components of that school that will not be accessible, which is not in accordance with our policies. Even with that, if you look at the site, you'll notice that the bus loading zone would have to be on a street, which again is a safety issue. There has been numerous incidents where children have been injured in this area. It would be on a trafficked road. What it would mean is when the buses are loading the students and the red lights on, no one could use that street at that time. And you've got residents right across the street. And you also have parking there, but the parking is not meeting the standard we talked about. So this is a compressed site. So from DTI's building recommendations, it was no. And from our recommendations, it was no, because it wasn't meeting the basics of our guidelines. We looked at option B2, which is acquiring the daycare property and then putting the school site there. Again, the pros are still the same. And better yet, we could actually orient the soccer field a better way. The cons are, in many cases, still there. Building demolition is still required. You still have to displace the students. It's still not meeting our minimum site requirements. There's just not enough room to put 8 to 12 buses in a safe bus pickup zone with that limited capacity. We'd then have to go through the process of acquiring the adjacent daycare property. And there's waiving requirements from the tenant, getting the right to purchase, indemnifying the tenant to vacate the property, that sort of thing. So that there's other processes involved with that. It's still not a neutral site to bring the communities together, and the issue of the height of the school in the residential area is a consideration, a con. So again, the recommendation was no, both from DTI's building perspective and from the department's operational perspective. And I'll just point out up here that as you can see, when you talk about the size, we're talking about just over 5 acres of land with the daycare. Hillcrest, we did look at Hillcrest. It's land we owned, and for the same reason we would look at Besborough in this process. The site is smaller. They don't have a sports field now as it stands. In this version, there was absolutely no room for a sports field. You would still have to have you'd still have issues with expansion in that area. We'd still have the same issues with Besborough with respect to displacing students during construction, having to pay for the demolition. There might be more ability to deal with 130 students versus 600, but still it would create challenges. The bottom line is it would not meet the basic planning guidelines we have for what we expect in a school of this nature and this size. And it's not a neutral site. The same issues with the Besborough site would apply to the Hillcrest site. We looked at McNaughton School. Now, we own a phenomenal amount of land at McNaughton. There's all the land to the front and there's all the land to the back. In the option we looked at for Bernice McNaughton, this is at the front area of the school and the size. That is approximately 21 acres, including the wetland that's in there. When you look at the pros associated to this, and I would point out that the land beside Bernice McNaughton, the identified where the arrow, I have my arrow pointing here, is actually owned by DTI. So we actually have access to more land there if we require it. The pros to this, it is a larger site. There's no land acquisition costs associated with this. It has the ability to share amenities with the high school. And that's not to say that we wouldn't put something in this school because the high school has it. What it allows is that synergy of having two facilities in proximity to each other to leverage what they have. So we find typically when schools like this tend to be grouped together, it allows for better sports competitions, better events of that nature. If one school has an auditorium and the other has a cafetorium, you can share off when those facilities are used much easier. And obviously the parking becomes, if you have a big event for one school on the weekend, you can use the parking of both schools to accommodate that. This meets the minimum site requirements for acreage that we'd look for. The school is still in a residential area. It's right beside one of the residential areas here. It is a neutral site for bringing two schools together again. They're again, same as with the Millennial site. There's potential for revenue from the sales of both schools. Services are available. It's zoned right. It's already a school there. As I mentioned, it's adjacent to DTI property. Cons, there is a question of access and traffic coming in. There's one access, which would be shared with the high school. It is adjacent to a wetland, which does limit the use of some of that property. And we can build into a wetland, and that's when I say wetland there, it's somewhat questionable the nature of it, but it's zoned that way. So long as if you remove wetland, you replace the same amount of wetland that you've removed, which we could do on the DTI property if we needed to. We don't expect we need to, but that option is there and it's easy to do. We do expect there to be a possible increase in, well, there will be likely increase in busing associated with this because the school is not as centrally located as the Besborough site, for example, is now. And there's a number of other advantages to this as well. There are some ongoing issues with the Bernice McNaughton School. This will allow us to address some of those issues concurrently with the construction of this, to resolve some of the transportation and organizational issues around the exterior of the Bernice McNaughton School. So when we put everything in perspective and looked at this, and because it was COVID, we made sure before we did this that we had discussions on this, that this was a good decision to make, or recommendation, I should say, to give to the minister. So prior to the presentation, there was numerous discussions with the district on this and the options and the pros and cons. There was discussions with the city on this. I personally spoke to Bill Budd, the city planner, back in June. There was a review of we did review the Millennium site contamination reports because this was a concern. There was a visit on site by the DTI representative, by my project manager, two of my senior project managers went down, and district representation, and they walked the ground at Bernice McNaughton. They walked the ground at Besborough, and they walked the ground at Hillcrest to confirm what was visible by satellite, what we seen from maps, what we had from available studies, to make sure that everything was correct. And in the end, this was the recommendation for the factors that I mentioned to the minister. It met the acreage requirement. It was accessible. It had a line coming in there right now. Centralization was not great, but it wasn't outside the catchment area. Ease of construction. It is a good construction site with services available, and it is complementary land use. It's already a school there. DTI's recommendation was yes, and our recommendation was yes as well. And this was briefed to the minister, and he made his decision accordingly based on the facts and information put before him. Now, I've added this slide as context, and what you see before you now is on the background, Besborough School. So if I was to put it in there as Athlon Avenue, Besborough Avenue, Milner Road here. You can see the school property line here. And in this corner, this little rectangle here is where the daycare is located now. The school that's superimposed here, and I'm not going to say that's 100% accurate alignment of size to size. The scale may be slightly different, but it's pretty damn close to the same scale, as close as we could get to a scale for reference point. That school you see there is École Champlain that was just built. It is approximately the same size as the school that we are planning on building for this West End school, combining Hillcrest and Besborough. And as you can see, here is the bus drop-off area for this school. Here is the playfield land associated with this school. There's the parking for this school, the parent drop-off, the space for play areas here and here, space for outdoor classrooms are here. And here is the building layout. Now, is that the most efficient building layout with respect to compressing it onto a site? No. But the way that layout is done, and that was done with the assistance of the architect working with the planning group, representation from the PSSC and the district staff, etc., provides a good alignment of the different grades that are in that school. In most schools of this size, it's often advantageous to have a wing that represents the lower grades, and then a wing that represents the higher grades, and then a central area where they come together with gym, cafeteria, cafetorium, administration, etc. and you would have your daycare facilities and your early learning facilities attached at the one end where the lower grades are. And you tend to try to keep some separation between them so you're not mixing much older students with much younger students for, I think, obvious reasons. So when you start getting on a compressed site, your ability to do that becomes somewhat more limited. And you also try to take advantage of as much natural light as possible to keep our energy efficiency down, and also to make them good learning environments for the students, and to provide safe space and separation. So you can see how the busing is completely separated from the parent drop-off, which is separated from the parking, which is away from the sports field, and any possibility of people interacting. Buses and kids and vehicles don't interact well together. So that was the process we went through. That was how it was involved. This is the details that was put before the minister. Less, you didn't see this particular slide I'm showing you now. This is for reference for discussion for this presentation. And he agreed with our recommendation for the site selected. So that summarizes the presentation.
Thank you, Tony.
Less than a half an hour.
Yep, I was looking at the clock here as we go along. We have a meeting, a continuous meeting, but anyway, I just wanted, something I didn't do is welcome any people that were involved tonight by tuning in on us here. And but I think I'm going to reserve the questions first of all for our two guests who are on with us tonight, Dale Hughes and James Upham. So I would say I would give them first shot at questions, and then the deck members can follow. So are you okay with that, Tony?
Oh, absolutely.
So who would like to start? Dale, you want to start, or James?
Dale, if you wanted to go ahead, that'd be quite all right. Or I could add my own thoughts. It's really quite all right. Whoever would like to do that.
Sure. I have three questions. First, I wanted to start off by saying that as a group, I think both PSSCs were thrilled that we got this approval for a new school. Anybody who's been involved in this process knows how long and arduous it is. And being the only Anglophone project that was approved, that was a huge accomplishment. So I just wanted to state that. We have several concerns about it being on the BMHS site. Tony, when I was looking at your presentation and the school that was superimposed on the property, to me, it looks like, at least structurally, that school fits quite nicely on our property. It seems to me that it's the outdoor space that might be the limiting factor. So that being said, I know that you mentioned several times that it's guidelines that you use when we're discussing acreage and how much acreage that is required for a school. Is there any wiggle room or any areas that we can tweak or alter as far as outdoor space so that the school can fit? And what comes to mind is the sports field. Is it a requirement that we have a sports field there? We have 7 sports that are played over middle school, and the only one that's actually played outdoors is soccer. So would it be an option to reduce the amount of outdoor space, instead reduce the size of the field to incorporate more of a green space where the kids still have room to play, there's still room for recess, but is that an option to try and reduce the amount of outdoor space that we need?
Oh, thank you, Dale. So I'll answer that question in 2 parts. The first part I would say is that even fitting the structure on there, you would be challenged, and I have the slide up here, fixing the parking in there as well, which would mean that you would pretty much have parking all around the school, and you'd be limited in green space you would have, or accessibility to outdoor education, an outdoor classroom, a community garden is another thing we try to put in our schools, or greenhouse, that sort of activity. So these are things that would be lost from the project, and I'm still not convinced that it would fit well in there and safely. And the other thing along that line is the ability to expand. Like I mentioned, we try to build our new schools now with the capacity to add more to the school, either to a wing or add another wing or expand it, because there tends to be growth, particularly now we're experiencing more growth than we have in the previous decades. And it's a challenge right now, and building a school on a compressed site that does not allow for growth will create a demand that you wouldn't even have place for portables here. So that's a real restriction on there. Not putting in a sports field. I mean, I appreciate that the organized sports would be for soccer, but the ability to have a field for your gym classes, particularly going up to grade 8, becomes important. And you may only play soccer now, but your options are to have other sports if they're going to take on rugby or take on other types of activities, field hockey. That facility is there not just for what's there now, but also for planning into the future. The school is going to be around for 50 to 70 years. So it has to be able to manage that. And that's one of the things we try to consider when we put this together. The question of could we put less in there? There have been circumstances where we've had no choice but to do that because there has not been a site that can accommodate this that would have been acceptable. That's not the case here. And I appreciate that the McNaughton site, or the Millennium site for that matter, are not as centrally located as Besborough is. But that's still not, the distances we're talking about and how far it's out are not out of the norm of what we would put a school in. And we wouldn't shortchange the community and the students of that community that would go with this school for the coming generations if we had that option to put it in. It wouldn't be fair to the population. Does that answer your question, Dale?
It does. Could we reduce the size of the actual footprint by putting a third story on? The picture that you're showing there, is that a 2-story building?
I believe components of that are 3-story. And the example that was shown here, like this is a much more spread out looking school. The example given here is actually a 3-story. You see it's not as spread out as much as the other school. It would look something like this. Now this is just a base template to use to show something like this of a school at this size. The actual layout would be different after the architect worked with the planning committee, but this is representative of what that kind of space of school would take up if it was 3 stories. So you could, unlike the Champlain school, fit the school on the site like this. You could fit your sports field and your parking, most of your parking on the site like this, but you wouldn't have your safe bus drop off, and there's no expansion. You're still not getting all your outdoor facilities that you want, that we'd like to put in our guidelines based on this. So there's literally safety issues around this when you're talking about loading zones for buses. And think about it, in the middle of winter, kids are wearing their parkas, they can't see well. You've got a street that's open to public use. You got people living across the street, and you've got people that can't get out of their houses for 15-20 minutes while buses are loading kids and their lights are running. Traffic can't get down the street. It's going to create problems.
Did you have another question, Dale, or we want to switch to James for a bit?
I do have another question, but James, if you have one, you can jump in.
If you wouldn't mind, Dale, yeah, there's a couple of things I wouldn't mind bringing up, and then if you would like to maybe make a couple more points, and then depending on how things go, I might have a couple other things I'd like to add as well. One point that I would like to make, can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. What you can watch happening in the West End historically is the West End begins to grow up around Prince Edward School. Then Hillcrest is built and the West End grows up around Hillcrest School. Then Besborough is built and the old or the new West End grows up around that, and Millennium, this whole neighborhood or series of neighborhoods have grown up around central schools that have been central parts and very key components of these communities. Having said that, though, they are and have always been serving a number of different groups of people from different spots and different areas. One issue that I've heard raised by both Besborough parents and Hillcrest parents is, again, this issue of ease of access to the property. This will be moving a school really kind of for the first time ever out of the old West End specifically. So this will create a situation where students from the old West End are going to be going up a very busy road, either biking or walking or being driven. This is going to create, I think, some fairly significant issues with traffic. Myself, I frequently cross Mountain Road. It can be a very busy road, even when you don't have rush hour traffic to deal with. I bike up there a fair amount. I walk across that road because I've nearly been hit so many times, and I'm 6'5". I'm a gigantic scarecrow. I stand out. I'm not a 5-year-old, and there are significant concerns that I have about that road. Having said that, students have been crossing that road since 1954 to get to Hillcrest. It's just that the road has become vastly busier and more dangerous. Regardless of where this new school goes, it is imperative that students, first of all, and parents, second of all, and community members as well, be able to access this place freely, easily, and safely. I recognize the issues that surround the Besborough site, and I recognize them at Hillcrest as well. I do have a lot of concerns around traffic flow with the proposed location, though. I recognize there are many strengths that come with pairing it next to a high school. I also recognize that not all high schoolers operate their motor vehicles in a way that I consider safe and reasonable. The same thing goes for a lot of adults as well. So when you get a lot of people in a hurry and zooming up and down a road, and there's a lot of little kids there are concerns that I've heard parents share, and these are concerns that I have as well, as my kids would be going there as well. Is there a way to improve the potential traffic flow in that area?
Yes. So what we're doing, we've already started discussion with the city on this, and DTI, when they go into the planning components of this, will be working with the city on the traffic flow around this. So there's different options that are available to us. If you look at this site, this school, Bernice McNaughton, was built with the ability to have access outside of just this main entrance through here. We actually own this section of land here. That's not a vacant lot. That's EECD owned land. So this should actually extend out like this, which gives access to this road, for example. And the map cuts off here, but as this road goes up, there's another entrance that is actually designed to come in to the top of our property at the top here that comes off this road. So there are other accesses that can be made to come in here. We'll be working with the city and the municipality in order to manage the traffic flow. And if there's a requirement to do work at the front entrance with respect to increasing safety requirements, that's a standard practice with respect to our schools. So
Just
whether
so-
we're working, yes.
I apologize. Just, I guess I would like to have, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot or in a box, but if there was some assurance that this was going to be, if this location is selected, the majority of the concern that I hear is surrounding the traffic issues that may come along with this. Would it be possible to have some assurance that if this location is chosen, that will come with an assurance that that issue is dealt with?
So to clarify, this site is chosen. It's not a decision point. The decision's been made. I'm telling you what the process we went through and why it
Fair
was
enough.
decided. So this is the minister has made his decision. This is it. This is where the school construction is going. And this is what the planning group is working with right now with the architect in order to fit this in here. The issue of traffic is one of the things we do work with on every project with respect to the city. So I can tell you that will be addressed with the city, dealing with issues of what's the traffic flow coming in, what are the buses, what are the best access points to use, what are the other options that are available, how will the students access this area safely, and what measures are in place to do that. And we DTI work with the municipality to put that in play. I can't tell you what they're going to be right now, but I can tell you it is just like the process I went through. That is part of this process going forward.
And just one more thing, if there was some way of, is there some potential for the construction of a bridge over St. George? Is there some potential for an increase to the infrastructure in that location to improve the ability of students to access this location on foot?
A bridge, that's not in the plan right now. Whether in discussion with the municipality, there's a thought that as this goes forward, that's something that could be considered or looked at. I'm not going to say no to anything, but I'm not going to commit to a bridge. That study has to happen on the traffic flow, whether, what does it mean if we get access into here and up here to control some traffic flow around that area. So, and I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying this would be the solution, but if you can imagine, because we own the land, we open that road here. This is a municipal road, and we have bus traffic and staff traffic coming in here, and we have student traffic coming in here or to the high school coming in the back road, and this is limited for access. So you can control the amount of flow that goes in one area or the other depending on what options are available, which then reduces that risk.
Thank you very much. Dale, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I did. I had a few more things. One of them was the infrastructure. So thank you for addressing that. That was a concern of ours. And I would really like to see a commitment that there will be an emergency services study as well as a traffic flow study before anything gets started. Another question that we had was, is there a timeline for construction? And what happens to the land Besborough and Hillcrest once the construction starts for the new school?
Okay, so first question, the timeline for construction does exist. Right now we're trying to get this was delayed due to COVID. Normally we would have done the site selection process back in March, April timeframe after the snow is gone, and we could do the appropriate tests on land as necessary. And then what would happen is there would be a DTI would then tender a contract for a consultant to come in, an architect to come in, and the planning committee would have been working concurrently at this time to develop the guidelines and the ed spec. The ed spec would be approved by the planning committee, and then that would then go to the architect. The architect would come up with a conceptual design. It would be approved by the planning committee, and then the detailed design would be undertaken, and the plans effectively developed for construction. That process takes about a year for the architect to be hired and to complete a set of plans. After that, the project is then using these plans. The projects are tendered, and obviously because it's a multi-million-dollar project, it's an international tender. It takes a month and a half to 2 months to get through that process. The tenders are looked at, awarded, and then construction starts. And construction for a school of this size is typically almost 2 years, 18 months to 2 years, depending on how the construction goes. So right now we're probably at least 2 years away from construction. The ed spec isn't completed yet, although the planning committee is working on it now. Once that's done, you're looking at about almost a year process for the design, and then another year and a half for construction. So about 2.5 years. That's if all things go equal and COVID doesn't jump into this.
Sorry to interrupt, this is Dominic here, and I've got to sign off. I'm going to try and get back on to the Zoom call just on audio when I'm in my car, but look forward to listening in for the next 20 minutes until I go into my next meeting.
Thank you for being with us, Minister. Have a safe trip to wherever you're going.
Thanks much. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Harry.
Okay. Good night.
Bye.
The second part of that question, what's happening with the land of the two schools? As mentioned in the presentation, they would be disposed typically because it is in a high value area, they would be offered for sale as they are. If there's no interest in buying the land as it is, then there's money in every construction budget we put together now, as common practice has in it, money for demolition if required. In this case, we don't expect we'll need it. We expect there will be offers on the schools as they are, the property as they are. But if not, then the schools would be demolished, the sites would be cleared, and then the land would be disposed accordingly. And then what the land is used for would be determined by the bylaws that are in place from the municipality.
Do you have anything else, Dale?
I do. You had mentioned during your presentation, when you had your list of cons, the cons for some of the sites was the increase in busing. The cons was buses currently were impeding traffic, and there was concern about student safety. And also when you were discussing the layout, the physical layout of the school, how it was important to have the elementary kids separated from the middle school kids because of influences. So how do you reconcile then putting a K-8 school next to a high school, which with what I'm guessing would be increased busing compared to what we have now?
Right, so we did identify that as a con, that there would be more traffic there, but there's significantly more land in this area to manage it. As mentioned, this front area here alone is 21 acres to manage this, and there's, I believe it is something like 30 some acres if you go back to where the city has, well, beyond the new sports field that's there, the property actually extends back significantly. I don't know if I have that on a site here, but this property line extends significantly back here into the wooded area, which is commonly used as park, but actually is part of EECD's property. So when you look at the site, yes, it is beside a high school, but they're not in the same school. And the facilities, the outdoor play areas, the playgrounds, etc., will have appropriate space separation so they're not together. The intent inside the school is that you're not having the students interacting in the hallways. And it's not that you can't do that. It just tends to be the preference when you're developing schools with different age groups not to mix. In this province, we do have K-12 schools where the age groups are all together in one school. And so in this case, they're not in the same school. There will be separation between the schools, and their play areas will be located in a way that does not interact with the high school. It will have its own space.
Can you expand a little bit on the benefits or the changes that would be made to the BMHS the school itself, or their grounds?
Sure. I would almost, the district is aware of this as well. I know Aubrey, we've discussed this, but there's concerns right now with how the traffic flows around the school, the condition of the traffic flow around the school, how the parking is laid out with the school, etc. As you'll see, the land takes into this area here. Working with the district, we'd resolve the issues around Bernice McNaughton with respect to traffic flow and parking and how that's managed, and make it a more conducive site to traffic flow and management. I don't know if anybody from the district wants to bring up any more detail on that, but there was a number of issues that we've been working with on the sort of the capital improvement side around the condition of the school and how the traffic flow works and how it's laid out at the exterior.
And this is my final question. Has there ever been an instance where there's been reconsideration for the site after the site has been announced? Is there a process for that?
No, there's no process for that. Normally when a site is selected such as this and it's been announced, as I've gone through the background here, it's been looked at in detail. It's been drilled down. We've worked with the district, we've worked with the municipality, we've worked with the people involved with that in order to come up with a site that's going to meet the long-term views of what's required. Unless something came up in the site that was missed. So if suddenly it comes up in option D that the site is horribly contaminated and it's worse than Millennium, then we may look at flicking to Millennium if that was where it came up. But with respect to, in this case, option D in comparison to either Besborough or Hillcrest, those two other sites are just too small for the size of school and the requirements needed to properly provide a long-term multi-generational facility for the communities.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I had.
James, are you?
It's quite a lot of information to process, and it is quite a big decision and quite a number of things simultaneously. I guess one thing I would just like clarification on myself, because I know it's a question that I am going to get. In the hierarchy between the 4 sites that were up for consideration, so we had sites A, B, C, and D. D being chosen as the just to sort of finish up, I guess, on the last topic. Were something catastrophically wrong with the option D, would I be correct in understanding that the remaining site that would be considered preferable would be option A, as opposed to the Hillcrest or Besborough sites?
Correct, it would be. We would go through the process of site remediation. We would go through the process of making the site safe, because we could build a proper facility there with all the appropriate spacing from activities, whether it's bus drop off, whether it's parking, whether it's the ability to expand, whether it's putting in your all the facilities that we have now with our present pedagogical processes that are at the exterior of the school, as well as having the ability to build a school that lays out in a way that best represents what that planning group would like to do with the school, and not be confined to, well, sorry, you've only got one choice of how the school is going to lay out because that's the only way it's going to fit. That's pretty limiting. So chances are that's what, I mean, we're not there, but if you were asking me to hypothesize, I would say that, yeah, that's where we would go. I mean, we were initially looking at Millennium as the option.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot with that. And I did ask you to hypothesize, and appreciate your willingness to do that. I guess it just sort of helps me understand that, in the vision, the context of what is generally appreciated as being this school moving forward, that other site would actually take precedence over the 2 sites that are currently in use. I find that useful, and I think that's information that's going to be handy to have. And I think that's something that might be useful for people to know too, perhaps, is that, even were a situation to crop up such that option weren't one, that another place would actually take precedence over the 2 that are currently in use. I just thank you very much for clarifying that for me. I appreciate it very much.
No problem.
If that tidies it up, I know I'm running a little late, but I made a commitment. We were going to resolve this tonight and get all the questions. I really appreciate where you folks are from. You're going to have to go back and explain it to people at Hillcrest and the people at Besborough. And I think you can use the material that Tony has provided for us, but it's not going to be an easy job. And I will now turn to the deck members for some of their questions, and I'll go to Norval, whose area this is in that, and I know he's been involved with your PSSEs for a good long time. So Norval, I'll give you the first question if you have anything that.
I never let an opportunity to ask a question go by.
Go for it.
Tony, first of all, I want to tell you how much I appreciated your forthrightfulness and the way you did the presentation. It's not, to me, it's not whether I agree or others agree or don't agree. I felt you did a good job as far as making it clear what your process was, and I certainly appreciate that. I also want to mention that I appreciate the fact that Dale and James have participated, and I know you're representing an awful lot of people right now with an awful lot of questions. I live in the neighborhood too. I know what it's been like the last few weeks, but I really have appreciated that with you. In here that Tony, there will be a question or two, but there's also some observations, because at the very beginning of this, Minister Cardy did mention that we want to learn through this. And I think there are some things that we can learn through this that will benefit all of us, because these kind of school updates are going to be happening more and more often. More aged infrastructure in established neighborhoods is going to need to be changed and improved. And if everybody is going to be fearful that their school is going to be zapped away and moved, you know, not unlike this, I believe this has still stayed in the neighborhood, but we've seen schools that have completely left neighborhoods and devastated them. So I think that we need to look at that. So here's just a couple things related to that. One, I'm glad they're taking the politics out of this. This school has lived the politics. We had a previous minister who fought for this school and even announced a location and a projected plan, and then it didn't happen. And that has put people on, you know, Robbie the Robot, a little bit of warning that was not a good situation. Although I think it was with the best of intentions, it put all of us in a challenging position. The second one is the midlife upgrade model. I'm going to make a suggestion that the department needs to really revise that. Schools like Hillcrest and Besbro should be allowed to be upgraded within something that meets a standard, but doesn't require movement or closure of the schools. And I think this would have been a perfect example where we had two schools that were well liked, well appreciated in their neighborhoods. And if we'd had a midlife upgrade option, and we weren't, Besbro was rejected and Hillcrest would have been. But if the model, I think you need to look at that model and see if there's something you can do for existing schools. Perhaps doesn't help these schools right now, but it sure would moving forward. James mentioned the traffic. I worked at McNaughton when there were no stoplights in front of that school. And I know what the city had to go through to get the stoplights put there. That is, you have some work ahead of you to make sure that that traffic pattern is improved. I hope you can make it work. I've heard engineers can make anything happen if they get the right amount of pay. Well, I'm hoping that you can, but I do see that as a challenge. And we do need to find ways that children who live in the new West End and the old West End can safely get to school without buses. So somehow we need to develop, whether it's that little crossing or whether we make sure there's crossing guards or whatever we do, because that school needs to be remain as best as it can a neighborhood school. And I think there's work to do with that, but I also know the school planning group is working hard at making that happen. So here's ultimately my question. When a decision like this is made now, because obviously the minister's made clear he's taking political leverage, interference, whatever you want to call it, out of the mix. I actually like that. I think that's a good way to move things. But obviously when it's really frustrating for some people and that leverage is gone for them, we have to go back to them and explain to them, this is what it is. This is what it is. And you were probably a parent. Can you sense a little bit of how that becomes challenging for people?
Is that the question?
Yeah, would you see that as being challenging for because the parents want their kids to be able to walk to school and bike to school, and this school does make that more challenging.
I understand.
What do we do to make sure that we can do that?
Well, the problem in this, I mean, each project is different in its construct and each project is different in its demands. We do try to, and we go through this, and as you saw in each one of the options, we did look at how central it was, how it fit, where it goes. And I'll be quite frank with you, if there was another 5 acres, 4 acres around Besboro or Hillcrest for that matter, 5-6 acres around Hillcrest, then this could have been something that we could have looked at more. but we just, from a safety perspective and the requirements of what we had to put in there, it just wasn't there. And that becomes the ultimate limiting factor to this. Now, with respect to the planning of getting there and the safety associated with this, like I mentioned before to James, we are going to be looking at that as part of this process to make sure that it's not just safe around the school, but it's safe getting to the school, and it's safe, getting off the school. Yeah, I'm still a parent. That didn't go away, although a couple of my kids have left. I still got one at school. And I do appreciate what you're saying with respect to, and I know that understanding that in a community where you have a history or a culture with the school that's been there for a period of time, that there's anxiety when that moves. And in particular, when you got a case of 2 schools that are moving and coming into one, we've got many examples, not so much in Moncton, but in areas up north where we've had to rationalize multiple schools to bring them into one. As I mentioned earlier, it's really a challenge in trying to, manage expectations, manage where a school goes. Everybody has, from their perspective, what they think is the right answer. And it's not the wrong answer, but when you look at, stand back and look at it provincially, you see that there's things that have to be taken into consideration for sort of the long-term vision of what challenges could be arising and what the expectations are. I guess the best way I could put it is if we built a school, what questions are going to be asked 10 or 15 years later if there is no sports field, if there isn't a safe bus drop-off, if some parent's child is permanently disabled and in a wheelchair because they didn't have a safe bus drop-off. And, the reason for not having it was a cultural issue in a community to centralize a school as opposed to that. I personally hold myself accountable to that to make sure that's there. And I appreciate someone could say, well, you've got a traffic issue getting to the school and a safety issue. That can be resolved through various methods. One was mentioned as a bridge. There's ways to fix that. I'm not that person, that deity that can make land that does not exist. It's not within my scope.
Appreciate it, Tony. Thank you. Harry, thank you.
We are running a little bit late, and unless some of the other deck members, I'm a room separate from you tonight, so you can't shake your fist at me or anything, but if
Harry,
you have a question, we'll take it. If not, we will adjourn now and come back.
Harry,
And we have.
I do have a question as well.
I have a question.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry.
First, just quickly, I'd like to thank Tony for his excellent presentation. I do have a question, in regards to, was there any thought given to having underground parking at the Bessborough site? Because I see it seems to be at least an acre, maybe an acre and a half, maybe 2. And if that was able to be done at a reasonable cost. And the second question I have, I might as well say it at the moment here, is that what is the cost of capital and operations per year of additional buses? Do you have any idea of what that might be? So I guess those are the 2 questions that I have.
Right. So the second the second question, no, we knew there'd be some additional busing. We're not sure, working with the district and based on the districts, I believe the district's zoning is 1 kilometer, I think, or is it 1.5 kilometers for distance from a school where you would be, the expectation is it's the parental responsibility to get the student to school. And how many are now outside that given this? We didn't do that calculation. There would be an increased cost or an increased number of busing that are coming. The first question, no, we didn't look at that. There was an option of a site there. The concept of building, just let me check what the size was for underground parking. Parking spaces for between 120 and 125 cars underground in a built up area is not something we would get into. That is, that's in an extreme. And I don't know any example that I can think of where we've gone into that level of extreme in order to try to fit a school on a specific site.
Okay, I guess the reason why I asked that is that if you're building a school, you're building a foundation, so you're essentially just going down a little deeper. I'm asking this as somebody who's not a professional in this area. So I just thinking, okay, if this was costed out, then that maybe it wouldn't give any more room. And as you say, maybe your decision is already made, but it would seem to me that where we're incurring additional costs on a yearly basis, maybe that's worth something in terms of busing, then maybe that's worth considering to see whether they balance each other out.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed who had the second question. Was it you, Roberta, or was it Sarah? Can you help me?
I had a question. I don't know if Roberta did.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess, first of all, Tony, thank you for coming in and presenting. I'm sure it can't be easy, and you did an excellent job being very clear at what the decision-making process was. And that's why we asked you to come. So we certainly appreciate that. I do have questions, be it about this school or future considerations for future schools, because as we talked about already, we're gonna keep having new schools pop up because we've got an aging infrastructure. And so my question is about the considerations with regards to urban planning and community. And so obviously, moving a school, whether it's 2 kilometers or 200 kilometers, makes a drastic difference to community. And so I'm wondering how that factors into the decision-making process, if at all. And I'm also, you mentioned that you chatted with Bill Budd. And so I know, you're connecting with the city, and so that's great. And so I'm wondering what would happen in conversations like that, what types of things you would have talked about, and how those considerations then impact your site selection.
Okay. So as mentioned earlier, we have a process that goes across the whole province. So there's very few municipalities in New Brunswick which have their own municipal planning capability. A lot of that sits with the regional service commissions. So there's limitations to, Moncton is kind of unique in that sense, in the fact that it has its own capability with Bill and his team. What we do, and as I mentioned before, it's whether you're building a new school, in this case, rationalizing 2 schools, pulling them together, removing 3 schools to reduce the infrastructure footprint to build 1, or even putting addition on a school. We make great effort to try to make sure that the school is going in an appropriate site with respect to the municipal plan and the municipal layout. We do not want to go through another École Champlain where we effectively had to build a brand new school because of the nuance of that area and the fact that it was constructed for some inconceivable reason in an industrial area with an asphalt plant behind it and a recycling yard that cut propane tanks off to the top end corner of it. That created all kinds of problems, and we had to literally rebuild another school. So we take great measure to make sure that where we're putting the school is appropriate with respect to municipal planning and how it lays out. As I mentioned, there is limitations with sites, and we do liaise with the municipalities in an attempt to get it in the right area. Now, we don't follow necessarily exactly what the municipality says or wants. I don't want to put words in Bill Budd's mouth or in that area, but I'm sure they would have liked us to look at the Millennium site more than the other one from a city planning perspective, taking land that's not developed right now and developing into something else. As I mentioned before, that the use of the land would probably increase their PILT requirements, and there may have been less pressures with traffic, although students would still have to cross the same road. to get to that school and that location as they would to the school they're in right now. But we do try to work with them as best as possible. There has been cases up north, for example, where we were putting a school in Campbellton. We worked with the municipality. They wanted the school in a specific site, and it was challenging. The city actually closed a couple of roads and gave that property over to us to add to our existing property in order to put a site in. So we do work with the municipalities when they're available and when it is the right place to put a school in order to make it work.
Anybody else?
Am
So
I
I-
able to ask one more question, Harry?
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. After seeing your presentation, Tony, I can now picture the acreage limitations and the size limitations that the Besborough property has. But Mr. McMullen, I never considered underground parking, to be honest. Are we prepared to, we're not the only school that's going to be coming across this, an urban school that's running out of space. Would we ever consider thinking outside the box and putting in underground parking, putting it 3 stories, possibly even 4 stories if it fit the fabric of the neighborhood?
Is that a question to me?
It's yes. Like, is
Okay.
that something that we could explore? Just because it's never been done,
Well, I agree.
doesn't mean that it can't be done.
And no, I would not say that. I would never say never, to be quite frank. That's the ability to look into something if it's required. Absolutely. And if this case, there was no other place to put this school and the only site it would fit was Besborough and the other site was 15 kilometers to a greenfield site outside the city, we would look outside the box and say, how the hell can we make this work and make it safe and meet all the requirements and everything with accessibility, kids getting access to everything safely, the whole busing issue, etc. That's not the case here. The case here is there are 2 other sites that are within a reasonable distance, not as central as Besborough, but certainly within the catchment area that meet the requirements, that do provide the ability to reasonably meet the planning guidelines and the safety requirements and the pedagogical requirements of the facility and put it in place. I mean, we still have the responsibility of spending the taxpayers' money appropriately. And to invest in something as expensive as underground parking and all the mechanical systems that go with this, all the issues with soil contamination, the extra type of reinforcement you need to build this, particularly if you're looking at building the school on top of it, are significant. And you're still going to be compressed in that site, even if you put the parking underground. You're still not looking at a play field. There's still going to be issues surrounding that. We wouldn't invest that money in something like that when a few hundred meters down the road is a site that meets the requirements.
I know I'm running at least a half an hour late. And the next topic is an easy one. Hey, Tony, it's budget. So you can see I'm in for an easy.
Harry, before you cut it off, I just have one last question because I want to take advantage of Tony's time.
Well, you guys know you're my boss, so you're right ahead. But if everybody complains, I'm going to blame you.
That's fine. You can blame me. I don't mind.
I'm not being serious here. Go ahead. Do what you want to do.
This one I think is just a quick question. There's not a whole lot of explanation. I see that in your map, you considered areas within the catchment area, and that was sort of your general geographic area that you use to find possibilities. And so I'm just wondering, is the catchment area just an assumed boundary because that's where those schools are coming from, or is when a new school is proposed and asked for, is there a possibility to shrink that area in terms of where you're looking? be it from our direction or our request, I suppose, or from your office?
But frankly, only if you turn around and say, we're not going to have those kids in that school. As you can see, even with that catchment area, there's a number of kids that outside that catchment area that go to that school. And we certainly didn't extend the catchment area of the school out to, out this way or out this way. I realize some of these may be out of bounds students, but this is the catchment area defined by the district. And that's where we looked at putting the, that's where we looked at finding the space for the school based on that. Now, this being said, in quite honesty, if a city comes up or a municipality comes up or someone comes up and says, look, we're planning on this project, we know what your guidelines are, we think this is the amount of space we need, and they are pre-planning ahead of time. Like I mentioned before, there was municipalities that have offered us components of land in order to put a school in there. And, we're not going to go out and be obtuse about this and say, no, we're not going to consider that. We have to look at everything that's out there. We do a reasonable, but if someone's coming up and it's a reasonable plan to put something in that's going to fit and meet our requirements, we look at that in seriousness as a priority option to that. There's other land options that we've looked at and considered, and the municipalities were investing, $1 million up front in order to support a school going in a certain area to getting services and stuff in there as part of the negotiations we've had. So we're not, the process is a general process to follow. If in the construct of this, there's not 4 solutions or 4 options, there's only 2 options, then we would look at 2. If there's only one good option, then we would say there's only one good option, but it has to be a good option. It has to meet basic parameters. So shortening up the catchment area, unreasonably so, and trying to limit where we can find a school because of that, at the detriment of the students who would go to that school with respect to what facilities they'd be provided, it would not be ethical on our part to do that.
Completely. Okay. That makes sense. So just if I understand correctly, the circumstances in which you would use not the exact border of the catchment area would be if at the time of requesting the new school, we said, we're requesting a new school and we will be redefining the borders, or if a municipality said we have this project and this, and it made sense to work together in that scenario. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we'd look at all options like that. I mean, normally if you're reducing the catchment area, it means you're reducing the population of the school. So if does the district turn around, is the district offering to say, right, instead of building one school and the economies of that and putting the 2 populations together, we said, right, we want 2 schools to do this and do this. Now, understanding that when you start doing that, because of the priority selection we have against the 7 other districts and the projects they put in, and we try to, prioritize, as was mentioned at the very beginning. I think Dale in her opening comments mentioned about, how we're not getting a lot of projects approved right now. We're not getting a lot, I shouldn't say a lot of projects approved. We're not getting money to do a lot of projects right now. There's only 1 or 2 projects being announced. And so there's very heavy competition out there as to which project gets selected. So there's criteria for that. So if you start manipulating the size of the school you want to get and creating more projects, which is not going to increase the priority of a school.
Say that we should say we're very pleased that we were selected.
Yeah, and this is a good project, folks. So this is a project we're proud of, and it should be there. It's a good one.
Harry, can I have time for a question?
Yeah, absolutely. You're my boss. Go for it.
It's just, well, I have Tony there. Later on, I'm speaking to my group about Salisbury Elementary School, which is next on our list of priorities for the district. And our parents are very concerned about the fact that they know, given the fact that we're not constructing that many new schools, that they probably are realistically waiting 5-10 years down the road before they're actually going to get their school. But in the meantime, their school is crumbling around them. And we have several special needs students in our school. And I liked your comment about, you know, you don't want a 3-story building because you may have students on the 3rd floor. But right now, we can't get our students to the 2nd floor. Or when he was in kindergarten, we had 2 of them at that time. When they were in kindergarten, they could not go down the stairs. They had to bring the kindergarten class upstairs. And it's causing a problem going up to the gym and that type of thing. So we have talked in the past about some sort of getting a lift of some sort to be able to put on the stairs. And I just figured this, since you made that comment, was a perfect time to ask you, because I am going to be making a motion later on tonight about that. What do you?
Well, I'm not going to speak for what the district's priorities are for their capital
Mhm.
improvement projects. What I will tell you is that we have in the past and continue to support the districts if this kind of project comes up in order to address non-compliance with any code requirements or accessibility. So there's an example of a school on the north side of Fredericton. A few years ago, I was heavily involved in making sure that appropriate lift was put in there for a student that was severely disabled, literally couldn't move themselves around, and had a unfortunately best way to put this sensitively, prognosis wasn't good.
Mhm.
But we put a lift in that school for that child
Well,
to get the floor so she could participate as best she could with her peers in all the activities. So the short answer to that question is we certainly support that kind of thing. And I know the districts are in a very difficult spot because they put in these good projects expecting, as you've mentioned, Salisbury to get in there to resolve the problems when we build a new school, which it would. And then you wait and you're bated breath wondering where you're going to sit. And there's always this, as we've said, so our infrastructure is not in the bestest shape in a lot of places, and there's competing monies for that. What I'll tell you is that we do at the department level support those kind of projects going forward in order to try to meet the code requirements are very important. And we
Because we're
focus
getting
on
more
those.
and more special needs students all the time. And it isn't just a visible, mobility issues. There are children with epilepsy and that kind of thing that, it's difficult for them to get up and down stairs.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I'll try to do this again, Tony. I'll try to say thank you to you. I'm going to say thank you to you for this great presentation. We know the decision has been made, and I don't know if you've done these before, but I want to say thank you from us to you for being available to us tonight, and hope you will, when you see the minister, tell him thank you from us too for making you available. So I'll say good night, and we'll take a 5-minute break here before we go on to the budget. Thank you very much.
You're welcome,
Thank
Harry.
you.
It was my pleasure, folks. Have a good evening and good luck, Aubrey.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
I'll be back in a minute. I have to get my macaroni and cheese.
Has to get us what?
My macaroni and cheese.
Oh, okay.
Are you talking about me?
Yeah, well, there's somebody on the picture I'm talking about.
This is a spiral noodle. It's not macaroni.